Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of CCSSO, Chris Minnick.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? I was coming in from the airport this morning. I have an important announcement to make. That if you're here for the American Idol auditions that are down the street, you're in the wrong place. Yeah, please just quietly leave down the street. So my cab driver asked me if I was here for the American Idol stuff. I thought, this is strange that I would fly in to sing. I will spare you guys my singing. So, well, first I want to welcome you to the national conference. This is a great time for us to get together. First, I want to thank ETS and John and his team for sponsoring this. Please give them a round of applause. And this conference is the biggest meeting that CCSSO does. And we couldn't do this without some key staff on our team. So I want to start with recognizing Scott Norton, Fen Chow, and Carla Toy, who, please wave Carla in the back of the room. Please give them a round of applause. And the final thanks that I need to do is we made a decision a couple years ago to really focus on what the states need out of this conference. And our planning committee has been exceptional at delivering that to this conference. So Marianne, Michelle, Jennifer, who are all chairs of the planning committee, would the planning committee please stand up and be recognized? So I was thinking about what I wanted to say this afternoon, and I thought, well, I've never seen it crazier than it is right now. The idea that states don't know what tests they're giving next year. When I was in Oregon working on assessments, we were planning 3 and 4 years out for changes that we were trying to make. I can't imagine how hard it is to be an assessment director right now in a state. And I think the people in this room bring a lot of different experiences to this conversation. But a test and the opting out of tests and how long we're going to take on tests and all of that is now much more in the public conversation than it ever has before, which makes each one of your jobs even harder than it was before. So there's some empathy for you to start the day. I think it's the time in American education for this change to take place. We made a decision as a group, and this is not based on the consortia or anything like that, but as a group, states have stepped up and said, we're gonna have better state assessments for our kids across the country. And that's something that in all of these changes, we can't lose sight of. I mentor a student in Virginia who is now a junior in college. He's the first in his family to go to college. And he was given all the same assessments as he came along in his career and was told everything was fine. He had a 3.5 GPA at a high school in Virginia. He went on to college, and his first year was a disaster. He wasn't ready to write at the level he needed to. He wasn't able to do mathematics at a college level. We had not told him the truth in our system. And this is not an indictment on anyone's previous work, but we have changed what's going on in this country by expecting more out of students with assessments. And we need to hold on to that shift. This is our moment as a group. This is our time to change what's going on across the country. And if we, politics are politics, but we got to hold on to some key principles. We need to keep telling kids the truth. We need to keep showing them if they're on a pathway to be ready for college or a job training program. These are things that can't be negotiated out as part of these political discussions. And finally, we as an organization had made a commitment to high quality assessments. And I think that commitment will continue to be something that you're going to hear from us from now and into the future. Scott Norton tomorrow will be talking about our test reduction framework that we've been working on with states. And I think it's important that we hear from parents and community members about how much testing is going on. But that is not mutually exclusive with the idea that we need high-quality assessments across this country. We shouldn't throw out all the work we've done in upgrading these assessments because we may be spending a little too much time testing. So we need to make those adjustments as we move forward. As I said earlier, everyone in this room has an important piece of this conversation. Each one of your expertise will be brought to find our solutions going forward. Whether you're working for a testing company or you work in a state, this is an opportunity to connect and make some of those discussions real so that each state can move forward with a high-quality assessment into 2015 and beyond. At CCSSO, we're committed to supporting that change. This change, as I said earlier, is monumental for the country. It is the biggest thing we can do together to make sure that the expectations are clear for kids as they're leaving high school and transitioning in to what they're doing next. This conference is only one of the ways we do that, and I look forward to connecting with many of you in the days as we go forward. So one of the things we wanted to do in this opening session is bring an international expert to have a conversation with us about the important issues that are emerging internationally and in the United States. Andreas Schleicher is the Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the OECD. And I want to title that long, Andreas. That's impressive. His office administers the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, to hundreds of thousands of students around the world. And the most recent covered 70 countries. PISA evaluates education systems worldwide by testing the skills and knowledge of 15-year-olds in reading, mathematics, and science. And PISA data has inspired Andreas to become a vocal advocate for the policy changes that make schools great. Andreas is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Theodore Heuss Award, awarded in the name of the first President of the Federal Republic of Germany for exemplary democratic engagement. Please welcome to the stage Andreas Schleicher. Thank you, Andreas. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. And I'd like to start by thanking CCSSO for inviting me to this conference. I've been actually very, very impressed how CCSSO over the years has been able to develop and maintain a national discussion and debate in the United States, including on topics like assessment. And I think this is crucially important. The kind of quality and complexity that we need to expect from modern assessments is very, very hard to achieve at local levels, at maybe even at state levels. I think you need the kind of national debate and discussion, and in fact, I would argue even a global discussion these days today. So that's what I want to talk about, not about the nature of our assessments in PISA, you know them very well, but about what we are learning from this, about education systems that have very, very strong results. And I want to start with something that is important too. How do we know that what we assess actually makes a difference to the lives of people? Well, to study this, one of the things that we did recently is we actually didn't test just school kids. We tested entire workforce in countries with very similar instruments than what we are using for PISA. And then we looked at to what extent the skills that adults have actually predict important life outcomes. And you can see even after accounting for social background and anything, you have that you double your chance to be in employment if you're at the high end of the skill distribution, level 4 or 5 on this assessment versus just having baseline skills. You almost triple your wages, having a good wage. And it doesn't stop with money. We see a strong relation with the health of people, with their propensity to volunteer. We see that people at the high end of the skills distribution see themselves as actors in political processes. They believe they can change things. People at the lower end of the skill distribution see themselves as objects of political process. They say, well, politicians are doing anyway what they want, so I cannot do anything in our societies. Those things are very closely predicted by the skills of people. Even trust, that's really interesting. You think about trust. That's something that has to do with how you were brought up, the quality of the institutions in your country. But in fact, most of those differences in the trust that people have to the neighbors, to the institutions, is actually, again, predicted by the skills of people. This is how the picture looks internationally. You can see that on the screen. If I show you the numbers for the United States, you'll be impressed. I'm going to talk a lot about deficiencies in the US school system, maybe even higher education systems. A lot of shortcomings in terms of the quality of the skills. But the United States is still better than any other economy in extracting value from skills, in translating better skills into better jobs and better lives. And that's very important too. What this tells you actually, if the United States would do as well as the best performing countries in the world in their education systems, you could generate huge amount of economic output from this value. So let's talk about how well we do in school. I don't need to talk much about PISA. I don't want to do this. You see a map of the countries that we cover in the background. We typically test about 500,000 students for every of these assessments that represent the different countries. The last data set was about 65 countries. We now have 75. Every cycle, we basically expand by 10 countries. And what's important is that we are trying to go beyond testing simply whether students can reproduce what they learn in school. It's not just an assessment of the content. We put a lot of emphasis in looking at whether students can extrapolate from what they know, apply their knowledge creatively in novel contexts. And we often get criticized for this. The people say, well, this PISA test is terribly unfair, you know. They test kids with things that we haven't taught them in the classroom. No? Well, you know, if you think that's unfair, then life is terribly unfair to you, because that's what's going to happen to you many times in life. No? And that's something we take deliberately, creative use of knowledge. And the logic for this is very simple. The world economy no longer rewards you just for what you know. No? Google knows everything. The economy rewards you for what you can do with what you know. So that's basically the logic behind this assessments. We look at math, reading, science. We have put more and more emphasis on problem-solving skills. Actually, this year, we have administered our first assessment of social skills, collaborative problem-solving skills. Very, very important dimension as well. Those skills are rising in labor market value, and so on. And then what's also special in our work, we actually try to collect a lot of data on the context in which students learn, teachers work, schools operate, so that we can actually understand and interpret the results and provide people meaningful feedback on those kinds of outcomes. One slide that you probably have seen in one of the other shapes already is you can, of course, whenever you do a test, you can see basically how do education systems, countries come out of this, and you see, you know, places like Shanghai in China up at the top. I can't anymore show them here on the screen. They're becoming so much better. Singapore, Hong Kong, some of the European countries, Switzerland, Finland, Netherlands, and so on. Yellow is sort of the average across the industrialized world, and in red, the countries coming out below that. The United States is sort of an average performer on that scale. Huge variability. No? These are kids that are 15 years of age, and depending on the country in which you were born, you come out quite differently on those kinds of assessments. Now, the gap that you can see here on the chart is about, you know, the equivalent of 5.5 years of schooling. So there's huge differences in the quality of learning outcomes. We see, of course, there's variability in the United States. Now, Massachusetts does well. No? So there is a lot of variability between states. You could see even a lot more variability across schools. No? We now have a school-based version of PISA that schools can take voluntarily, and we can actually see there are schools that are doing as well as schools in Shanghai. No? But there are also schools that are coming out pretty much where Mexico is today. So there's a lot of variability in the United States, among schools, and so on. We put a threshold at our assessments. We call that where sort of students move from just very basic knowledge. Now, level 1 is sort of where they can extract simple information, follow directions, do simple mathematical operations that have sort of a clear, explicit specification. And that's actually sort of where Mexico and Malaysia come out. But don't ignore that. You know, if you actually look at the United States, there's still about a quarter of American 15-year-olds that do not make it to that level. You go around, every fourth person whom you meet at age 15 actually has trouble getting above that kind of threshold. No? So there is a lot of variability on that. You can, of course, you know, this is not the end of the scale. You know, you can drill down a lot further. There are countries that are all deep in the red line. We've added here some from other international assessments from TIMSS and so on. If you're in Ghana, basically results are very, very low. Variability is even further rising. One of the things that we have recently done, actually done by Professor Hanushek in Stanford University, is actually estimating, if we use historical growth regressions, how much money would we add to our economies if we could ensure that every student, every 15-year-old, has at least acquired the completion of level 1 on the PISA assessment. So we're expecting not anybody to become like, Finland or Japan or Singapore, but, making sure that every student has at least the baseline level of skills. And in fact, we're talking about a lot of money. In the case of Ghana, that's of course quite an unrealistic scenario, but if they would actually make sure that every student has baseline skills, we're talking about 40 times their current GDP over the lifetime of those kids now. Or in dollar terms, it's about 4,000 billion US dollars. If you look sort of at the top end, Brazil on the red, you can see we're talking about 750 times their current GDP, or 23 trillion US dollars. We can look at the countries among the OECD. In the case of the United States, we talk about 27 trillion US dollars. This tells us something about the high cost of low education performance. I mean, what you really see from these numbers is that the cost or the economic value that is lost today because of poor baseline skills far exceeds any conceivable cost of improvement in education. Even Singapore, doing very well on average, but there's still a lot of kids falling through the radar screen. And that also is a lot worth of money. So I think this is very important for us to keep in mind. It takes money, it takes resources to build better schools, but the investment is just a tiny fraction of the high cost of low performance. But I want to introduce a second dimension, and that has to do with social equity. In some countries, we see that the success of students is largely determined by the social background of families. What's interesting, that is not the case everywhere. In some countries, that impact is pronounced a lot less strong. If you look at this chart, everybody wants to be there where performance is very good and learning outcomes are equitably distributed. No. All students from all social backgrounds succeed. Nobody likes to be here where performance is poor and there are large social disparities. That's obvious. But actually, if you listen to much of the policy dialogue that we have today, this discourse is very much about, how do we trade off quality against equity? Some people believe if you want to do well on something like PISA, you just have to accept that there are large disparities. Or if you put your focus on equity, you're going to end up with mediocrity in the whole system. What's interesting, actually, that's not what the data tell us. You can actually see here where countries come out on the dimension of quality in learning outcomes and equity in the distribution of education opportunities, as measured by PISA. And you can see, actually, there are lots of countries in the green quadrant. Countries that do well, and that do well for children from all social backgrounds. And there are countries that don't do well and still have very large disparities. Very, very interesting kind of patterns that we see. And you can see here again, Massachusetts is doing quite well on average. But even in Massachusetts, kids from poor social backgrounds have a lot lower life chances or educational chances than kids from wealthier backgrounds. So a lot of work to do. The last thing I want to bring in, and I don't have data for all countries here, but I want to bring in money. I'm making the dot for each country now proportional to what is being spent per student on education. And if money would tell you everything about the quality of an education system, you'd see all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. But in fact, spending per student explains only about 10-15% of the performance variation among countries that you can see here on the list. And you can see that actually, if you look at Luxembourg, that's the most expensive education system. They're doing neither well, nor do they produce equitable outcomes. Money alone is not a guarantee for success. That's what you learn from international assessments. The United States, quite expensive system, not extremely, but also there, it's an example where money alone is not enough. Actually, one of the things that we have done in our assessment is looked a little bit behind it and tried to study actually how do countries spend their money. First of all, where you see the red dot, that's basically spending in relation to spending capacity of a country, no? In terms of national wealth. It varies a lot across countries. No? Here you can see, for example, considering what the United States could invest in education as a very wealthy country, it does actually invest very little. But what's more important is that countries spend their money very differently. One way in which you can spend money is by paying teachers well. No? That's what the green bar shows you. And I've highlighted Korea here. No? Korea is a country that invests enormously in teachers, paying them really well to attract the best and brightest into the teaching profession. But they don't stop there. They also invest in student learning hours. They have students sitting in class for long hours. And they do a third thing. They want their teachers not only to teach, but they want to have their teachers doing lots of other things too, professional learning communities, investing in their own careers and the careers of their colleagues. So that there's a lot of time and resources that go in other things than teaching. Costs them money. No? Costs are driven up further by the yellow bar. And you ask yourself, how can the Koreans actually do that? And the answer is very simple, class size. They have very large classes, and that allows them to buy all of these other things. No? So whenever the Koreans ask themselves, do we want a better teacher or a smaller class, they go for the better teacher. You go to the next country on the list, that's Luxembourg. The red dot is exactly where it is for Korea. No? Spending is exactly the same. But in Luxembourg, teachers and parents and everybody likes small classes. No, that's what's driven up the cost. The blue bar is driving costs up. But even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. No? So the price for small classes has been, teachers are not particularly well paid, students don't have enough time in school, and teachers have very little time to do anything else than teaching. Two countries spending the same amount, investing their resources very differently. You can go to the end of the scale, two countries, Finland and Sweden. Neighboring countries, no? Similar in many respects. But what do we see in Finland? Finland is not like Sweden. Finland is a lot more like Korea in the way it allocates its money, putting the priority on teachers, saving on classes. Sweden is a lot more like Luxembourg. No? And you look at the United States also, that is more of a country in the second group. And actually, if you do more sophisticated analysis of this kind, and what you see here is just a very simple overall picture, you actually do see patterns in which countries doing better actually invest their resources. You can't detect that from the national data. No. You can only detect it when you compare across countries. It's very important. In many countries, those kind of data are frozen in time. If you touch the area of how much money get teachers paid or how many hours do they teach, those are very kind of strongly influenced debates within countries. You look at this across countries and you can see actually education systems around the world do make very, very different choices. Well, of course, some people say, well, maybe smaller classes are not so effective, but teachers hate large classes. Actually, I wanted to find out about this. So we did a survey, actually. We surveyed 90,000 teachers around the world, and we actually looked at to what extent class size does relate to job satisfaction. And in fact, we found no relationship. There was no relationship between the size of a class and the degree to which teachers felt content with their job. What we did find, there was a very strong relationship between the type of students teachers had in the class. No? The more they struggled with classroom management, the unhappier where they were. No? And actually, what these data tell us is, countries doing well invest in classroom management. They provide their teachers with access to the resources, to the kind of training. They don't take much students out of the classroom. But I want to come back to this. There's one last point I want to make to this, and that is basically the argument about culture. Some people look at this data and they say, well, those differences among education systems are hard to change. This is all about culture. These Asians have some math gene, and that's why they're so good in mathematics. It's very hard to sort of replicate. If that was true, you would see this picture over and over and over again. Year after year, you would see the same picture. But that's actually not what we see. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. You see here Chile in 2003 and Turkey in 2003, more or less at the same point. And when you actually look what happened is between 2003 and 2012, Chile was moving upwards. They became better. But Turkey was moving up much faster. And they were not only moving upwards, they also closed a lot of the socioeconomic gaps in the population. So two countries achieving very different results. If you look at the top end of the scale, Shanghai, you could barely see them in 2009 and 2012. They disappeared to the screen. Or Singapore, another country. Now, these high-performing countries do not stand still. This is not about catching up in a static world. Everybody's moving. You look at Germany. Significant improvement, but even more significant improvement in terms of closing social gap. The performance gap between students with and without an immigrant background was halved in 6 years' time. That's what's possible. Or you look at Italy, country moving up to the right, or Poland, probably Europe's biggest success story. No? Very huge improvements. Or Portugal. No? Now that's the sunny side of it. Of course, there are some countries that have seen declines in performance, not many. But one example is Sweden. They started out here, and they dropped quite a lot. And it's pretty well understood from this data, actually, what caused those kinds of drops. Well, what you can actually see, fortunately, in most countries, we've seen some lifting up of performance. And actually, this is an area where the United States is sort of a sad exception. It has really not moved at all, virtually, at the age level of 15. But overall, we do see movements, but they vary across countries. And that really tells us this is not about changing culture. This is about changing education policies. Not about firing teachers. It's about doing something different with those kinds of teachers. So I think that's a very important lesson to be learned from this. One last slide that I think illustrates this point very well, is the issue around poverty. Here I'm organizing the data of performance by decile of social background. You can see in the red dot the kids in Mexico coming from the 10% poorest neighborhoods across the OECD area. And in the green dots, you can see the kids coming from wealthy families, okay? That's Mexico. You compare that with Chile, what do you see? If you come from a poor background in Chile, same family background as the kid in Mexico, you're actually doing worse in Chile than in Mexico. If you come from a wealthy family, you do better in Chile than in Mexico. So two kids born in different countries in the same social circumstances come out very differently depending on the education systems they go to. And you can do that now across countries now. Very similar results. And what you actually see is, you compare the red dots across countries and you can see kids from similar social backgrounds achieve very, very different results depending on the education system in which they are. You can draw a line. The 10% of the most disadvantaged children in Shanghai, and they come out from families, who work as construction workers. They may not have proper housing. They work as migrant workers in the city of Shanghai. Very, very disadvantaged context. But they outperform kids from the wealthiest families in many of the wealthiest nations. And that actually shows us it's not just about poverty. We've done something interesting, actually squaring those data with data that we got from principals. On the horizontal axis, you see the share of principals who told us that there were a lot of disadvantaged kids in their school. That's the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we measured the actual disadvantage in PISA. And you can see those things do not line up very well. No, they shouldn't. The dots should fall on a straight line, on a diagonal, but it's not true. Actually, look at Brazil. Brazil has a lot of poor kids, the poorest country among which we have data here. And principals tell us there are a lot of poor kids in my school. Now, the world is sort of in order in the case of Brazil. But you look at the United States, there is not that much social disadvantage in schools. Now, the United States is a very wealthy country. Everybody knows that. But actually, it has the largest share of principals who tell us that they have all these disadvantaged kids in their classroom. And you ask yourself, maybe social disadvantage is a construct that actually we create in our heads and our minds is not actually reflected often in the school reality. And it's only comparative data that can actually reveal that. You look at Singapore, the counterexample. In Singapore, there are a lot of poor kids, about twice as many as in the United States. But actually, school principals tell us, no, we don't have many disadvantaged kids. This is normal. These are the kind of children that we have and that we need to educate. So you can actually see how those different perceptions vary across countries. Top performers. Who does really, really well? And I think this is for us at the OECD was the biggest surprise about United States data. We knew that there were a lot of kids with very low levels of performance, but we expected the United States actually to come out really well at the top end of the distribution, having lots of really great schools. And I've visited many, many very, very impressive schools. I'm going this afternoon to see High Tech High. I mean, there are a lot of really great places in the United States. But you look at this overall, and you can see actually the United States comes out rather at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of having a large share of top-performing kids. The number 1, 2, 3 places all go to East Asian countries, which are not only doing well on average these days, but which have made enormous progress and actually advancing the top end of the distribution. Most of these countries, as long as we can measure over the last 10 years, have dramatically expanded the pool of people at the top end of the distribution. That is the new story. No? And you can see, again, huge variation across the United States. If you go to Massachusetts, a lot of really great kids in there. No? Very bright kids that can compete with kids in the highest performing countries. Connecticut is sort of a so-so, an average country. But if you get to Florida, you talk about the same level as in Turkey or the Russian Federation or so on. So huge variation in the United States in excellence in education. That was, for us, one of the biggest surprises. Why is it so important? Actually, if you go back to our survey of adult skills, where we looked at skills in the workforce, we can actually see that people with just so-so levels of skills, no, here I talk about problem solving, have seen the biggest job losses that we have seen. And that's because those jobs are very well done by computers today. People with very low skills have seen quite stable employment. Other people pay you less and less, but you can keep your job because our economies actually keep a lot of people for low skills. No. But the only job creation, the job growth that we have seen has really been at the high end of the skill distribution. So this is why those data really, really matter for people. It's not just average performance. The share of top performance has a huge impact on the economic and social outcomes in a country. Last point I want to make about the PISA data is about mathematics teaching. One of the things that international comparisons tell us is that actually, mathematics isn't mathematics. Mathematics gets taught in very, very different ways across countries. I want to show you one thing. One way to teach mathematics is to teach students, simple mathematics in complicated contexts. In Iceland, they do that a lot. I must say, when I was a student, that's the kind of mathematics I hated most. You had to read through these long texts and then extract the number, solve the problem, and you're done. If you go to the high-performing countries, Vietnam, Shanghai, and so on, they don't teach mathematics in that way. There's another way how you can teach mathematics. That's the focus on conceptual understanding. Do students master the paradigms, the underlying building blocks of mathematics? Do they know what probability is, what space is, what a mathematical relationship is? And actually, there you see the opposite picture. Iceland comes very low on that. The high-performing countries actually come out on top of this, or many of them. Relationships are not always clear-cut, but you do actually see patterns in the way in which mathematics is taught. You can identify them by the respective assessment tasks. A lot of variability from which we can learn about the design of effective policies. And that's what I want to do in the last part of my presentation. What can we do to catch up with the top performers? I want to identify the factors by the relative impact on the outcomes as we can measure them. But I also want to take into account the political and economic cost of educational change. Now, that's something else also important. Everybody wants to do things that are easy to do and very important. No, obviously. Nobody wants to put money in things that are maybe not so important and very expensive. No, but again, open for discussion. I want to talk about some of the things that are really, really important, but very hard to do. And then, we can look at some of the quick wins, the low-hanging fruits, things that are easy to do, maybe not so important. So I'm going to put some of the factors that we have measured into this, and I'm going to talk you through them one by one. The first thing I want to start with is at the top end, this commitment to universal achievement that we see in the highest performing education systems. Sounds easy, but is actually very, very hard to do. What you can see actually in the highest performing education system is that they have consistently high expectations across the board for every student, whatever social background. Very little tolerance for failure. You know, something like you have now with the Common Core is the matter of course for decades in some of those countries. They know exactly, every student, every teacher, every principal, every parent knows what is expected, what good mathematics performance really looks like. It's very clearly spelled out. But there's another part to this, and that is actually whether we believe, you know, in the power of schools to change this or in the power of, you know, background. We asked students in PISA once a really interesting question. We asked them, you know, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And the majority of students in the United States, but also in some European countries, said, oh, that's clear, you know. Success in mathematics is about talent. If I'm not born as a genius, you know, I'm going to study something else. You ask that same question to the students in Shanghai or in Singapore, and 9 out of 10 students tell you, if I try really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. Two very different perspectives on education. One is, you know, I'm just sorted by this education system. I'm going to come out in whatever way I came in. In the other case, I own my success. I trust the system is going to help me to succeed. And surprisingly, those figures correlate almost perfectly with the impact of social background on learning outcomes. Very, very important. We have a commitment to education, the belief that, you know, every student can succeed. There are typically universal educational standards across the board, combined with a high degree of personalization, not that much tracking streaming, and there is a very clear articulation of, you know, who's in charge. What's the role of parents, what's the role of teachers, students, and so on. A couple of data points on that. Here you can actually see on the vertical axis mathematics performance, and on the horizontal axis you can see this measure of student self-efficacy. It's a PISA measure basically of this idea to what extent students believe they have the tools to do well in mathematics. And those figures are highly correlated within countries, but surprisingly even across countries. You look at Shanghai, China, doing well on both the kind of non-cognitive aspect and in terms of mathematics performance. Now people say, well, is this again a cultural attribute? Well, actually not at all. You can see Shanghai on one side, and Japan and Korea actually, they do very well in terms of student achievement, but students do not have the belief in their own abilities that students in Shanghai have. So a lot of variability, but there's a positive correlation. The opposite side of it is, you know, who do your students blame when things go wrong? I contrast here the average with Shanghai and France, you know. The French kids say, well, you know, if I didn't do well on the test, I was just unlucky, or the teacher didn't get me interested in the material, or sometimes the course material was too hard. This week I made bad guesses, or my teacher didn't explain things well. The French kids blame anyone except themselves for the low results. You see that much less pronounced in China. And again, you know, I think those factors tell us a lot about the education system. To what extent do students own their success and do well? And surprisingly, those things then come out. We also see that this has an impact on gender differences. Look at this. This is the gender gap among the top performing students in mathematics. We all know in most countries, actually, even though on average, boys and girls have very similar performance in math, at the top end, boys are much more represented. Well, much of this is actually explained by those non-cognitive attributes. To what extent do I see mathematics or science not as school subjects, but as something that opens life opportunities for me? We started to measure those non-cognitive attributes, and we can actually see that they explain a lot of the gender gap. Now, the squares here are the figures that we see in the United States, for example. You can see there is a significant gender gap. Once you take out those non-cognitive attributes, that gender gap disappears in the majority of countries. So that's also what tells us we have to become better in assessments like PISA to measure those kind of non-cognitive attributes, because they are lost. They're going lost under the radar screen. In most education systems, the United States included, have done a pretty good job in making sure that boys and girls get similar test scores. But once you look beneath that, you know, you can see actually a lot of patterns, and that's why I think we have to become better at measuring this, because it has consequences. When you ask boys and girls, you know, do you want to take math after, you know, they leave schools, there is a big gender gap. And what does this gender gap do? It influences people and the choices they make when they apply to college. And that has an impact on the earnings and wages that you get. So actually those attitudes in schools are today better predictors on outcomes than simply the scores, the test scores that we see. That's why we are trying in PISA more and more to measure those things really well. Gateways in instructional system, that's obviously very important, and this is basically the Common Core agenda in the United States. And it's about clear ambitions, systems that are aligned, strong instructional systems where the goals translate into instructional systems and assessments and so on. And that's something that you can actually see really well in most high-performing education systems. There is a consistent and coherent educational instructional system with rigor, high level of cognitive demand, focus, they try to teach a few things really well and at depth, and coherence. They're able to model meaningful learning progressions. And again, those are mirrored in the kind of assessment tools. So I'm not going to talk about this further. I think that's something everybody here is familiar with. I want to focus a bit more on the issue of capacity. What about teachers? What about school principals? That is a very, very tough part. How do you attract? How do you develop? How do you retain the best people in teaching? How do you provide the kind of instructional leadership that is needed? The HR management in schools, and so on. I want to show you a couple of data points on this, actually. This is all about developing teaching as a profession. It's about recruiting, it's about supporting, it's about career structures, and it's about the value teachers have in society. Let me show you one piece of data on that. Here you see the share of teachers who tell us that they think their job is valued by society. If you are in Finland or in Singapore and Korea and so on, the vast majority of teachers think, society really respects what I do. If you get to the United States, it's about 1/3 of the teachers. If you get to France or the Slovak Republic, it's 5 in 100 of teachers who go every day to their school and think, society doesn't care about the job I'm doing. No surprise who's going to apply to become a teacher. Now you can say, well, that's just teachers complaining. This is not assessment data. These are not hard data. We hear that often. But actually, you can square them with the PISA results. Here, the teaching value, and on the vertical axis, the PISA results. And there is a relationship between those. It's not so clear what the causal nature of that relationship is. Maybe, where teachers do a really great job, society is going to respect them. Or maybe where society has a lot of respect for teachers, you're going to attract really great people into the teaching profession, and they're going to do a great job. We do not know the causal nature. But what we do know is that the value teachers perceive they have in society is somehow related to outcomes in education. Some people say, well, the solution to all of this is very simple. Just get the best people in the country to apply to become teachers. Surely that's part of the solution, but it's not so easy. Actually, one of the things I've read in many US papers is the top performing education systems all attract the teachers from the top third of the graduate distribution. I really wanted to find out about it. So one of the things I did is, from our survey of adult skills, I looked at the skill distribution of university or college graduates. And that's what you see on the blue bars here. It's the middle half of the numeracy scales of college graduates. And what you can see is, when Japan and Finland come out really well, Poland and Italy not so well on this. But this wasn't the question. Where do teachers fit in? The skills of teachers is tested. And that's the red bar. The first thing you see is there's actually not a single country in the world that attracts its teachers from the top third of the graduate distribution. In most countries, teachers are pretty normal people in terms of their skills. They're average graduates. There's variation. If you are in Japan, Japan has highly skilled college graduates, and teachers come more from the top than from the bottom. If you go to Korea, the skills of graduates are lower, but teachers still come more from the top. You could explain that with place. If you go to Poland, graduates are not highly skilled, and teachers come rather from the bottom. But remember, Poland is the most rapidly improving education system. They didn't change their teachers. They actually gave their existing teachers, not so highly skilled according to these test data, they gave them the opportunities to evolve, to develop. They invested in the teaching force. And what this tells you is really, the recruitment part is undeniably important, but actually what you invest in teachers matters a lot more. You look at the United States, actually also here. Some people, I have heard that many times, I don't know where this comes from, but people say, our teachers come from the lowest end of the graduates. No, that's not what these data say. Teachers in the United States are pretty average people when it comes to the numeracy, literacy skills, and so on. So recruitment is important, but it's not the magic bullet. I think that's very important. There are other parts. We surveyed teachers. We actually wanted to study what drives self-efficacy among teachers. They believe, I'm going to be good at my teachers. And one of the things that we found is actually collaboration. Where teachers teach jointly as a team in the class, more often they feel more effective as a teacher. Where they observe other teachers' classes and provide feedback. Where they engage in joint activities, where they take part in collaborative professional development, consistently across countries, they believe they become better teachers. And surprisingly, you go to Asia, you go to Japan, to Singapore, to Shanghai, that's exactly what you see. There's so much investment being made in teachers working together to define, work on their profession. Very simple means. Now you can see that actually on this chart very nicely. This is sort of teacher cooperation measured by us. When it comes to informal, and here's the United States, when it comes to informal exchange and coordination, that happens a lot. Now, teachers are very social people in general. They talk a lot and so on. When it comes to the kind of professional collaboration, actually that is pretty rare across most countries. Team teaching, for example, well, in Japan and Denmark and so on, a lot more than in other countries, but it's not very common. Collaborative professional development. Now, Israel, Singapore, Australia do a lot. The United States, maybe, but it is not as common as you think. When it comes to joint activities, classroom observation, one of the most powerful drivers for improvement. How frequently, how rarely does this occur in most of the education systems? We often don't use the devices that are actually relating to better outcomes. Teachers' needs for professional development. We ask teachers actually, what do you believe is going to make you a better teacher? What do you need? Teaching students with special needs comes out most strongly now, technology and so on. But there's a lot of variability across countries now. Most teachers in the United States tell us, well, actually, I don't need that much professional development. On average, across countries, the numbers are higher. In Japan and Korea, for example, teachers express a lot of need for professional development. You can say, well, didn't they do so well? No, but they want to become better. Or, pedagogical competencies. In Korea, many teachers tell us, I want to become better in pedagogy. In England, only 2% of the teachers say, I need to invest in my pedagogical skills. Or knowledge of the curriculum. Again, the Koreans come out on top. They know their curriculum well, they can teach it well, the results are good in tests. They want to become better. They have a much higher bar in terms of aspiration. In Spain, 2% of the teachers who say, I know everything I need to know, don't bother me with professional development. A lot of variability in the need expressed by teachers in this. Incentive structures and accountability. That's a theme I think everybody here is very much familiar with. The only comment I want to really make is that many high-performing countries have a very strong, careful balance between vertical accountability, that's about moving information upwards, and lateral accountability, that's actually sharing information across the system. You have often these multi-layered assessment systems that bring information from the classroom to the school, to the system, to the region, to the province, up to the national and maybe international levels. That's, I think, a very, very important part. Some people, I heard this, actually, Chris, you mentioned that at the introduction, the United States tests a lot. If you look actually at students, that's actually not true at all. That students in the United States get tested as much as students in the average OECD country. But if you actually look at how students get tested, there's a big difference. Many of the tests in the United States are sort of above the school level. In other countries, there's a balance between school level, system level tests on this. But I think the fact that students get tested a lot isn't very, very much true. Autonomy and accountability, I want to show you one thing that I think is really important. On the vertical axis, you see the test scores of countries. On the horizontal axis, you see the level of school level autonomy. And there is a weak relationship among the two. Generally, you can say, high-performing education systems offer their schools a bit more discretion. What might surprise you is the position of the United States. You think the United States is the country of local control. And that's true when you look at the district level. Actually, when you look at this through the eyes of schools, schools in the United States have a lot less discretion as schools, for example, in Japan, the United Kingdom, The Netherlands, in the Netherlands, every school is a voucher school. Every school is sort of defining its own instructional environment. But you also see that the relationship is not so clear-cut. Now, Shanghai came out so well on the PISA test, but actually is a quite regulated education system. And that's interesting. You see, actually, there are two things together. If you are in a country that has no shared notion of what good mathematics performance is, now, you think about a country that has no common core or state-level standards or anything comparable. You're in a country where it is not clear what good performance is. Actually, what you see in those countries, school autonomy works against you. The less autonomous schools do better than the more autonomous schools. But if you're in a country where actually there is a common understanding of what good performance is, you can see how it works in your favor. Where data are not public, where there's little transparency in the system, school autonomy works against you. Where there is a higher degree of transparency in the system, actually school autonomy predicts outcomes. So you can see actually these variables do not work in isolation. They work often in conjunctions with others, according to these test data. Where school autonomy means, the principal decides everything and schools have and teachers have no role, you can actually see school autonomy works against you. Where you have an approach of distributed leadership, where teachers are part of that equation, you can see how school autonomy becomes your friend. So in fact, that's very, very important that we look at those variables in conjunction. And that tells us a lot about quality assurance. You look at a country like Singapore. They don't do just one thing, they do many things. For example, also like in the United States, also in Singapore, teacher evaluation is based on student learning outcomes, but only 20%. 80% is derived from other variables. No? You can see, for example, every school implements a standardized policy. They talk to other schools, other experts. They have a strong approach to teacher mentoring. They collect written feedback. They have external evaluation, internal evaluation. It's multiple dimensions of quality assurance with a lot of data collected through different eyes and different lenses. And that's really what you can see in many high-performing education systems. Very strong emphasis on quality assurance, but actually quite complex and sophisticated methodologies. Last point I want to make is really investing resources where you need the most. And you can see actually that high-performing countries actually are typically very good aligning resources with the challenges. Now, they attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging schools, and they make effective spending choices. I mentioned the example of Shanghai many, many times. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school in Shanghai and one day you say, I want to become principal, the system tells you, that's a great aspiration, but first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So they systematically pair high and low performing schools at the teacher and principal levels and share their resources, share their expertise to actually make sure the resources arrive where they need to be. A couple of data points on this. I'll keep that very brief. You can actually see on the horizontal axis not the amount of money that is being spent, but how equitably resources are invested in education. And then you can see you would want to be on the green part where sort of there's a stronger emphasis on equity. You don't want to be in the red part, but the majority of countries actually spend their money regressively, essentially, and that's true for the United States as well. Basically, the kids from wealthier backgrounds get access to the better resources. The kids from disadvantaged resources actually suffer most. There are very few exceptions. Finland would be the model where they actually have deliberate policies and practices that make sure the students who need the resources most get access to the best teachers. You can also see that, when you look at qualified teachers, you can see clearly that the shortage of qualified teachers is a lot more concern in disadvantaged schools in the United States, but in many countries around the world. We are not very, very good in getting the best teachers to where they need to be. But the countries that actually get that right have a big performance advantage. That's really what I wanted to share with you. The last point is perhaps obvious. You want to make sure that policies and practices are well aligned across the system, that they are coherent over time, that they're consistently implemented, and also sort of that people do what they say they do. And again, that's a feature that we see. I think what you can see, international comparative data really show you what's possible in education. I think that's the biggest power of assessment data overall. Not just show you where you are, but where you can be. What do the highest performing countries show us in terms of the quality, equity, and also efficiency in the education system? But most importantly, they give us a sense for the pace of change that is achievable. We've seen the rapid improvement of some of the countries that actually have turned around their education systems, invested in getting things right, and actually delivered the results in a very short period of time. I leave you here. Thank you very much.